In today's video, I'll show you guys how you can paint Paradra the Emperor's Children Chaos Space Marines using only a brush and only Citadel paints in some easy to follow steps.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Balanced Miniatures.
Emperor's Children are probably the only Chaos Space Marines chapter who can rock pink armor and still scare the bejesus out of even other Chaos Space Marines. And to be honest, I had not been the biggest fan of them before, but after reading their backstory in the Horus Heresy books, they jumped up quite high in my rankings, at least among the traitor legions.
So if you want to see how I painted the purplish pink armor, the black trim, the green eyes, all the leather, cloth and metal bits, and the freehand Emperor's Children emblem on this guy, then let's paint some crazy Slaanesh followers.
Step 1 will be to paint the pink armor.
This will be the most eye-catching part of this model, the thing that will actually identify him as a son of Fulgrim, so this is the thing that we will have to really get right, or even perfect, since we are talking about the Emperor's Children after all. I started from a black primer so that I don't have to worry about the shadows and the shading too much, since those will just remain black and won't be tainted by the white. This also allows me to just leave some random armor panels in black without repainting them, since that is part of the Emperor's Children color scheme. You can start from a zenithal highlight as well, which would lead to more vibrant colors easier, but it would require more work on the shadows later, and instead I'll invest more time in building up the vibrancy of the armor with additional layers. I'll be using 4 paints to paint the armor panels, and as you can see I started with Naggaroth Knights as a base coat and made sure to paint all the panels with it fully. This paint covers quite well for Citadel, but we have black underneath, so it's better to use multiple coats to reach the maximum color of the paint. The reason I went with this color is because the bluish purple tone will look good as our shadow color for the pink, and because having this under the pinkish colors directly instead of the black will help with coverage and with making the colors I'll be using later more vibrant. Once I'm happy with this, I'll switch to the next color, which will be Screamer Pink. I will layer this over almost the whole surface of the armor panels, covering most of the Naggaroth Knight except in the deepest shadows, like inside the inner side of the leg armor and around the trim of the armor panels. And this last bit about the trim is important because I don't want to use any washes over the armor later, but I still want to maintain a separation line between the trim and the pink panels. This means that I need to be more careful with where I apply this color, trying my best to not paint it directly under the armor trim. Ideally, there should be a thin line of Naggaroth Knight left between the black trim and the pink panels. And if you mess this up in some places, it's not the end of the world, you can just paint it back later with some simple black lining, but with Naggaroth Knight instead of black. But please don't use washes on the armor panels, that is a level of heresy that even the Emperor's Children would not dare to commit. The third paint we will be using is Pink Horror, and we will be covering around 60-70% of the Screamer Pink with it, concentrating it on the top of the panels. Simply imagine that the sun of some unfortunate planet is shining on our Chaos Marine from above, and whenever it would hit the armor panels, that's where the Pink Horror goes. Anything facing away from the sun should remain in Screamer Pink. This paint is quite transparent and we can use this to our advantage. Because of its transparency, you need multiple layers to cover. So to create a transition between this and the Screamer Pink, you just paint a layer, let it dry, and then paint another layer, but this time make it a bit smaller, making sure that the middle of the highlight is covered fully and the borders remain a bit transparent. Doing it this way means that there is not much need for glazing, but if you're fine with investing a tiny bit more time and know-how, you can simply apply a couple of glaze layers for smoother results. One more important thing I'm doing with this color is to paint all the edges on the armor. Alright, time for the final touch on the armor panels. We will be using the aptly named Emperor's Children to repeat what we did before, but making this highlight even smaller inside the Pink Horror, leaving quite a bit of that previous color visible. Once again, I'm relying on layering for establishing the transition between the two colors, but a little bit of glazing can smooth things out further if you're up for it. And just like before, I'm also painting the edges, but only the most visible ones facing up towards the light this time. And that is the most difficult part of the model done. Now I just have to correct the mistakes I made with the pinkish colors on the trim by painting over them with Abaddon Black, and we are ready to move on to the rest.
That brings us to step 2, which will be to paint the base coats of all the other elements.
I started with the loincloth first using Cadian Flesh Tone. This color covered quite badly and I needed a lot more layers than I thought. I guess I'm just not used to Citadel paints anymore. For the few leather bits like the belt and the pistol holster, I used Rhinox hide. I might not be the biggest fan of Citadel paints, but this is still a fantastic color. 1 or 2 layers of this will be more than enough. Fortunately for us, the Emperor's Children color scheme comes with black trims, so we can just leave those black and paint only some of the small metallic elements with actual metallic paints. I used Iron Hand steel for, well, you have probably guessed, all the steel parts, like some parts of the gun, the grenades and the knife. For all the gold ornaments I used Retributor armor, which is another must-have color from the Citadel range, by the way. Finally, I painted the base coat of the eyes with Caliban green. And to be honest, this might not even be necessary, and I could have just painted the next highlight color directly on the black, but it took me no time at all, so why not? The really important thing is to only paint the raised lens inside the eye and leave the socket around it black for contrast.
With all that done, we are at step 3, shading.
And as I said earlier, shading the armor panels is heresy of the highest order, since we would ruin our nice highlights, but shading the metal parts is absolutely necessary, and it is also a valid way to paint some of the more textured elements like the loincloth. And this is as easy as it gets. Just take some Nuln Oil and paint it over all the steel bits, and do the same with Reichland Flesh Shade for all the other parts like the gold, the loincloth and the leather bits. One layer can be enough, but I prefer to wait a bit for the first layer to dry and then apply 1 or 2 more. This will darken everything down even further, and you can create more contrast with the highlights.
Only 2 more steps to go, so let's continue with step 4, where I will highlight everything I've just painted, except the pink armor, of course, since that is already finished.
The trim is the second most important element on the model after the armor panels, so let's start with that. At first I wanted to use 3 colors for this, and I started by edge highlighting everything with Corvus Black, but soon I realized that it is not light enough compared to the Abaddon Black, and the highlights are barely visible. Instead, I suggest to use only 2 paints. First, Mechanica Standard Grey, edge highlighting all the trim, and if you don't have much experience with edge highlighting, I suggest you watch the guide I have on the channel about it. I will put the link in the description. Edge highlighting is one of those things that becomes much easier with practice and by using the right techniques, and this is the perfect color scheme to practice it on, since you can simply erase or correct any mistakes with Abaddon Black and no one will be the wiser. The second and final color for the trim will be Administratum Grey, and I won't paint every single edge with this. I will only concentrate on the edges that are facing up and towards the light. If you want, you can also try to make the previous highlights slightly thicker and paint this color inside those, but thinner. You can also use the same 2 grey colors to make a couple of scratches and dots on the armor panels that we didn't paint pink to make them more interesting and the model to look worn and battle damaged, but this is optional. Moving on to highlighting the other elements, first I used some Cadian Flesh Tone to bring back the color of the cloth. Since the shade darkened everything down, I could use the original color as a highlight. And since I don't want this to draw a lot of attention, I didn't highlight it further, it looks good enough as it is. For the leather, I did something slightly different. I used XV88 to do some edge highlights and scratches, and then I toned them down and integrated them with some thinned down Rhinox hide. But you can also just use the Rhinox hide to do some edge highlights if you prefer that. With that, I only had the eyes and the metals left, so let's look at the eyes first. Originally I painted them with Caliban green, now I painted almost completely over that with Warpstone Glow. Technically, you could also just paint this over the black immediately if you wanted to go faster, and the difference wouldn't be huge. Finally, I went up even further in brightness and used Mood Green to make the front part of the lens brighter. For the metals, I used a similar method as for the loincloth. Since the washes darkened them down, I could use the original colors to highlight them and create contrast. This model and a lot of other CSM minis as well have a lot of small ridged cables and harnesses where you want to only hit the ridges and not the space between them, and for that you can use a little trick which is actually quite similar to how you do dry brushing. You take some metallic paint, let's say Iron Hand Steel, but remove most of it from the brush on a paper towel. You only leave enough so it barely leaves a mark where it touches, and then with very little pressure you brush the side of the bristles along the ridges following their edges. This way you will only deposit the paint where it belongs, but will leave the recesses untouched in the shadows, creating intricate details without a lot of effort.
At this point, our Emperor's Children Legionnaire is essentially done, and this is the point where you can apply some transfers on the shoulder pads. But the problem is that CSM transfer sheets generally don't have any Emperor's Children specific transfers. So you can either leave him as is or try some freehand like I did, so it's time for step 5, the freehand.
I deliberately left this shoulder pad black in the color scheme so that it's easier for me to make corrections without messing up any transitions that I had made earlier. When you do a freehand, it's always a good idea to start with an outline first. And to be honest, I was struggling a bit to find a good paint for this in the Citadel range, but in the end I just did it with Ushabti bone which I had lying around, even though it wasn't perfect. It was still better than to try with the yellows that I planned to use for the emblem though. When the sketch was at least close to what I wanted, I filled in the center and then painted over it with Iriel yellow. Painting this over black would have been a pain, but over the Ushabti bone it was quite easy and the outline informed me about where to put the color. Once I got the full coverage, I started to make small corrections to the shape with black and went back and forth for a couple of minutes, finally settling with something that might not please Fulgrim, but it was good enough for me. I added some Flashgitz yellow highlights to give it a bit of depth and called it done. Finally, I did a simple base with dry brushing some XV88 and Carrickstone over some texture paste I had applied earlier, added some tufts, painted the rim black, and the end result looks like this.
That's it for today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys found it useful, and if you did, consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know which legions or chapters you would like me to paint next. See you in the next one.